should also be able to test and evaluate the merit of such theoretical frameworks and develop implementation strategies that align policies and especially intervention measures to the most appropriate theoretical frameworks. And finally, we should, of course, be in a position to mobilize processes of monitoring implementation strategies and outcomes that are associated with specific intervention measures. So the purpose of this study is really to seek to demonstrate the utility associated with considering prospective population dynamics as a precursor to prescriptions about social policy interventions in Commonwealth Caribbean small states. And what I've done is basically disaggregated Commonwealth Caribbean small states into 4 population clusters, which I term moderate growth momentum populations, quasi-stationary aging populations, high growth momentum populations, and aging populations with high potential for declining size. And you can see next to those classifications, those categories, the Caribbean islands that Caribbean countries that fall within the respective domains. In terms of the objective of the study, it really seeks to provide an account of current and projected social and demographic characteristics of the populations within each of the 4 population clusters and to draw on heuristic insights signaling prospective population trajectories to determine principal domains that should be targeted in the context of each of the 4 population clusters. To do this, of course, we are talking about small states, and there's a literature on small states and a few major contributors, including Crowards and Downs, Sutton and Payne. But what we see when we look at small states are generally countries that have small population sizes, small land area. Income is a critical factor. Of course, some countries are considered small states, but they have large land area. Guyana is an example. But one of the key underlying features of small states is the notion of vulnerability, inherent vulnerabilities. And all of these countries that I've referred to in the Caribbean context have high levels of inherent vulnerabilities. Of course, to counteract such vulnerabilities, we have to build resilience. Now, if one is to look at some of the data that we have for the high growth momentum countries, we can see, well, Belize is the only high growth momentum country. The medium growth momentum countries are Antigua and Barbuda and the Bahamas. And basically, those are countries that still have a high inbuilt population growth momentum. In the case of Belize, largely due to migration, there are lots of immigrant populations moving into Belize, and Belize still has above replacement fertility levels. In the case of the Bahamas and Antigua, these countries have near replacement. Bahamas has below replacement, but Bahamas also has relatively high immigration into it, so the population growth momentum is there. And you can see that by 2050, while the population of Belize would have doubled what it would have been back at the end of the first decade of the new millennium, in the case of Antigua and the Bahamas, it would have only increased by about 30%. We could also see for the quasi-stationary populations, basically those are populations that have stabilized at a certain level, and we would expect that Barbados will never cross 3,000 persons. Guyana, perhaps, given trends at the moment, may never cross 800,000. St. Lucia may never cross 200,000, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines perhaps would never cross 120,000 because those populations have more or less stabilized. But what you will find with all of these countries is that there's phenomenal aging taking place, and insofar as that aging is taking place, it's going to really have implications for the age structures and life stage events and aspirations and so on that we need to be taking account of. In terms of aging populations with high potential for declining size, we have countries like Dominica, Grenada, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago. These are countries that when I actually see the population size going right back down sometime past before 2040. And I'm not sure that many people are taking these kinds of dynamics into account, not to mention the age structural issues and what sort of implications it would have. So, I mean, time is running, and I have to sort of move on. So in terms of some of the main policy domains that were obtained on the basis of looking at the various forms of capital, whether you're talking about social capital, human capital, financial capital, whatever, these are some of the main policy domains. But insofar as we have to build resilience, we have to focus on a number of key attributes. And I'm talking about not only building resilience in the sense of ensuring that at some point, we can enhance spiritual well-being and material well-being and all those things. But what is even more important is to attain greater levels of equality, reduce inequalities, and even as we achieve greater levels of equality, what are we doing about achieving greater levels of equity? So we have to be constantly concerned about all of these attributes as they relate to some of those policy domains. And what you see there are just 5 of them. I have another set that we need to look at, and dependent on the age structural dynamics that evolve in the passage of time, I think, bureaucratic elites in particular have to be cognizant of these changes. So in a sense, I mean, you can see in closing for Belize and Guyana, these are some of the main policy domains that one would need to target efforts into. In the case of Antigua and Barbuda and the Bahamas, Barbados, you can see some of the other domains there. And then for the whole set of countries, including those that are likely to see declining population size, given the kind of population dynamics that are unfolding, I have here some of the policy, social policy domains where effort should be directed. Overall, I would think that as far as policy agendas go, we have to be concerned with overarching issues of aging considerations, spatial and population redistribution, spatial considerations and population redistribution, the demographic dividend and related considerations, international migration trends and related considerations, and somehow at the end of the day, in making our decisions about how we treat with these future populations in terms of who we target now as actors and beneficiaries, we need to incorporate some of this thinking into how we go about, targeting our efforts as we look at the various policy domains that I have articulated. I got the time chart, so I guess I have to stop here. Thanks a lot for your attention.
I'll just talk while you walk up. Thank you very much, Godfrey, for that interesting presentation. Hopefully, what we're trying to do is to manage the time for the presentation, so we will devote some more attention during the discussion period. I now invite Professor Figueroa to make his presentation.
Good afternoon. Simple mathematical inequalities that elucidate the underdevelopment of national economies. This paper is motivated by the work of Thomas Piketty, a French economist, who in 2013, wrote a paper, a book called Capital in the 21st Century. It centers around a very simple mathematical inequality regarding profits growth and income inequality. Having looked at it, it got me thinking about mathematical inequalities relevant to Caribbean-type economies. Having done so, I sought to link these back to the work of Caribbean authors to see how these inequalities could be identified with authors within the critical tradition. I do not have time to deal with all the inequalities on which I reflected, but I give a few examples. In the talk, I will look at inequalities that are inspired by Lewis and Gervin's work relating to saving and investment rates and foreign ownership, leading to denationalization. Al Francis, our most mathematical of the economists here, gave a paper in which he looked at unsustainable debt and accumulation. I then look at what I call a Pantene inequality, which, although not developed by him, I think does some justice to his work. My interest is not with Piketty's inequality and his conclusions, but since it inspired me, I mention it here. If R is the rate of profit, or the return on capital, and G is the growth rate in the economy, then R greater than G leads to increases in income inequality. That's the essence of his book, which is about that big, and you can sum it up just like that. I should say, because R represents the increment on income of the capitalists, and G represents the income on everyone's, the increment on everyone's income. If R is greater than G, then the capitalists are getting more money than the rest of us. In various works, Lewis and in Gervin, in Foreign Capital and Economic Underdevelopment in Jamaica, different concerns are presented in relation to issues of savings and investment and growth of the national economy. In Lewis's work, his relevant work has not been widely read, and what has been read has not been generally well understood. I note that the catchphrase, which was used by Bess to lampoon, which to me means ridicule, Lewis's work, Industrialization by Invitation, still has wide currency. But it's my view that it gravely misrepresents Lewis's views. And I am inviting persons to reconsider its use as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of Lewis's birth this year. In the inequality that I present, if foreign investment, the rate of growth of foreign investment, I sub F, is greater than the growth of national investment, I sub N, this leads to economic denationalization. Now, for many persons today, the question of national versus foreign investment is of no consequence. As I'm not remembering his name, but as the leader of China who put them on the path said, what is the difference between a black cat and a ginger cat if they both catch rats? Say his name for me, Carrie. Say his name for me. Deng Xiaoping. Sorry. Okay. But to me, the difference between foreign and national entrepreneurs relate to the extent to which they will spread themselves into the nooks and crannies of the economy. Oftentimes, the foreign capitalist takes the best and leaves the rest. And there are many opportunities for development which will not be developed unless you have national entrepreneurial classes. The world is flat, they say, but it's not that flat. If we assume savings is equal to investment, then the stock of foreign savings used being greater than the stock of national savings used leads to denationalization. And this was a prime concern of Lewis and Gervin. In the Social and Economic Studies issue of 1958, Lewis wrote an article in which he expresses in words the inequalities which I present here. And this was one of the first conferences of the economies, on the economy, actually. There were before, but that was one of the first post-war conferences on the economy. If G, again, is economic growth rate, and C is the consumption growth rate, if G is less than C, then private savings are declining. Similarly, if T is the rate of growth of tax revenue, and E is the rate of growth of government expenditure, then T less than E means that government savings are declining. And if these two, or the combination of them, are holding, then it means that national savings are declining. If we return to Piketty and consider the rate of return on foreign investment versus the rate of return on national investment, bearing in mind that foreign investors take the best and leave the rest, if R sub F is greater than R sub N, this may lead to denationalization. In this slightly more complex inequality, we see the circumstances under which it would or would not. And this was a central idea to Gervin in relation to the share that the national economy got from its resources, especially in relation to mining, a concern that other Caribbean economists had. And this relates to the tax rate on foreign profits and the tax rate on national profits. So if the product of the tax rate times the rate of profit on foreign capital is less than the tax rate times the rate of profit on national capital, then it means that we are getting a larger growth in the profits that go to foreign versus local capitalists, and this would lead to denationalization. And we know that all the economists that I discussed were concerned about taxation and taking the biggest share from the profits on enterprises in the economy, especially we know in relation to the mineral sector, of which Pantene was very concerned, but so were the others. And certainly all of them agreed that rents should not be pocketed by the foreign capitalists. So in the case of Gervin and others, some of them considered nationalization, but in the absence of nationalization, then the question of how do we ensure that the nation gets its fair share was certainly a concern of all of them. In his paper, The Dynamics of Debt in the Jamaican Economy, Al Francis draws on the work of an American economist, Domar, to critique the policies pursued by the then Minister of Finance in Jamaica, Omar Davis, hence the paper's subtitle, Domar versus Omar, The Burden of Debt and the National Economy. Francis's work is mathematical, and it would need another 15 minutes in order to present it. But I just give you one of his scenarios, which is as he presented it. This is where the debt is continuously rolled over. That is, the interest is simply added to the principal, and we continue to borrow more money in order to pay the debt. In this case, if R is greater than G, the model that Francis uses with the continuous rollover of debt, then debt tends to infinity over time, which is a Jamaican case. If R is equal to G, then debt is maintained at its initial stage, which is the original debt over the income. And if R is greater than G in the long term, if R is less than G in the long term, it tends to zero. Okay. I now look at what I call a Pantene Inequality, which deals with one of his primary concerns, which is how do you deal with a depleting asset, as in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, your oil or your gas reserves. And I set up the inequality in terms of P being greater than A. That is, P is the rate of the depletion of your natural assets, and A is the resulting growth in other assets, which are going to ultimately replace the income stream of the depleting asset. And what I say, if P is greater than A, then you are depleting your asset in an unsustainable way. That is, the depleting asset is being mined unsustainably. Now, in his work, Pantene looked at various alternatives in terms of how that depleting asset, the income flow from that depleting asset, could be utilized. One way in utilizing that depleting asset is the establishment of a national wealth fund, so that as the depleting asset goes down and the potential income flow from it goes down, then you are building up your wealth fund, which is going to provide you with an alternative flow of income when you have depleted your asset. However, it doesn't have to be directly placed in a wealth fund. There are other investments that can take place. But whether those investments go into the development of your human potential or it goes into the development of your infrastructure, then it does not matter, basically, but you have to monitor this inequality. So to summarize, I was inspired by Piketty's Inequality on Profits, Economic Growth on Inequality. I have presented to you Lewis and Gervin's, inequalities that were inspired from Lewis and Gervin's work relating to savings and investment rates and the difference between foreign and national saving and investment rates, and what are and taxation as well, and what are the implications for denationalization. I gave you a little glimpse of Francis's work on unsustainable debt and accumulation. It should be say unsustainability and debt accumulation. You notice the and is in the wrong place. And finally, I looked at Pantene's work on the unsustainable mineral economy. So it only is left for me to thank you and to thank Dennis for the contribution he made to our understanding of the paradigm.